really emphasize the voices of these speakers because these women have been denied their voice for so long. Now, with that, I need to put immediately a bit of a asterisk in light of the previous presentation as well. The words of Suchon, I'm using a translated version from French into English in the volume by Stanton and Wilkin. Now, of course, that maybe does do some damage to the original philosophy and to her voice, but since this is an English presentation, I'll keep it to that. And later in my own research, I do really want to delve into this original French version as well. So for this presentation, I'll first give a bit of a methodological reflection on how I'm going to study these women. Then I will talk about their background, the early modern context, their own works, and their lives a little bit to contextualize it, which is quite important in the history of philosophy. Then I will talk about how they talk about oppression of women, and I'll go briefly into how they understand the liberation of women. So let's start with that. Where's my clicker? First, methodology. Now, in this presentation, I really wanted to give an example of how it would look like to diversify philosophy. This is also research that really is my passion, but we need to note that we cannot do that in the same way as we would study canonical figures, right? For example, Descartes has a whole interpretation, reinterpretation. There's a dominant way of school. There's a common, at least more or less agreed upon sense of what his philosophy says. That's not the case with this woman. With Mary Astell, there is more research done. She also, of course, has the advantage of having written in English, so there's more interpretations, there are more critical volumes. With Gabrielle Suchon, the scholarship is really in its first track, let's say. There's no yet a comprehensive account of the totality of her philosophy. So what I'll be doing is, of course, very much in depth to the authors who have spoken or written on these figures before me, but I'm not going to say that I argue for or against the dominant position. I'm also partially making it up as I go within this research. So what I'll do during this presentation, I'll answer two main research questions to give you a bit of a guide that you can follow. So I'll first ask, how did Gabrielle Suchon and Mary Astell conceive of the oppression of women during the late 17th and early 18th century? And how did they propose to liberate themselves? So both in their own lives, how women can be liberated, but also how women as a group in general can become liberated. The second question will get a bit less of a focus because also for my own interest, this idea of the oppression plays a very important role. And I'll do that by introducing a new connection between these two, by creating my own school, let's say, or situating them within a school. And that is that of theological virtue proto-feminism. The proto between brackets, we'll get back to that. But as people have mentioned, as Weiss, for example, has mentioned, if we want to or reintroduce these figures into the canon or create a different canon or at least get them some traction, we need to give them a place within philosophy. And the best way to do that is to situate them within schools, to connect them, to bring this conversation. And that's why I want to um, point out to the similarities and see how these two figures, who, by the way, didn't have no interaction. Their lives might be similar, they lived in a similar period, but they didn't have letters or correspondences or in any way interacted with each other philosophically, which normally, as historians of philosophy, would give us a bit of pause. Is that a good thing to do without this real connection? But in this sense, in bringing these women back into the conversation, I think this is a valid approach. That's also what, for example, Elsa Dorland tries to do, which is discussed in the volume by Stanton and Wilkin, by placing Gabrielle Suchon together with, for example, Anna-Maria von Schuurman as logical feminists. So that's a bit of the background that will be at play. I hope by the end of the presentation, this school would make sense. Now, it might be a bit vague, but we're going step through step, and hopefully that can also guide this presentation. So before really delving into the nitty-gritty philosophy, I want to give a bit of a overview of the early modern European, of course, context in which these women lived. And that in Europe, in France, and in England, there were really these conversations, and I'm going to butcher this word, but the querelle des femmes, the woman question. And this question centered around debates on the nature of women. Are women rational creatures? Sometimes even are women human beings? And this is the debate, the intellectual time in which they wrote. So they had to fight for the right to be educated for their nature. Um, and we also see that not only in the philosophical context, but in general, women, well, there are ages that it was worse, also in the early modern period, as in most of history, women were oppressed. In England, there, for example, there was the abolishing of nunneries, Catholic nunneries, because of the Reformation. I'm guessing most of you know this history better than I do. But what this basically meant, this legal change, was that women could no longer go into an institute where they were protected from having to marry and being under the full control of their husbands. Because at that time, if you were married, you were fully legally under the control of your husband. Financially, you could not even leave the house without his permission. So these nunneries were a bit of an alternative pathway where women could, to a very, very, very limited extent, be educated. But even that was taken away. And in France, during the reign of Louis XIV, there were active debates or ridicules on the learned woman. They were ridiculed, and it was really like, woman, let's be honest, you're not meant for this. Let's keep you down and be humble. Don't try to usurp men too much. So that's the context in which these two women wrote. And then I also want to give a bit of a background on these two women. But before I do that, I want to kind of scan the room and see who has actually ever heard of them to kind of situate them. So maybe start with Mary Astell, because she's described as a first feminist and she was from England. Could you raise your hand if you've ever heard of her? Okay, nice. That is more than would be in for example, a Dutch context. So that's nice. And who here has ever heard of Gabrielle Suchon? That's three people. So there's still a lot of work to be done, even within these amazing contexts, to really bring back the voices of these women. So let's give a bit of a brief background. First, Gabrielle Suchon. Gabrielle Suchon was born in 1633 in France. She was born to a family of relative means. And when her father died when she was 12 years old, she was placed into a cloister. Now, after 25 years, she escaped that cloister. We don't know how. Her biography is full of mystery. And the rest of her life, she spent teaching, reading, and writing, and she lived with her mother until her mother died. There's still a lot of mystery, as I said, on the life of Gabrielle Suchon. There's not much known. But one of the most important things that we do know about her is that she didn't have a male figure in her life, as in she didn't have a brother, a father, or a friend to protect her, to guide her, to teach her. She did it all alone, which is she's one of the only early modern woman we know about who did not have this male support system. So that's quite extraordinary. She was a proud autodidact and she established quite extraordinary works. Then to go on to Mary Astell, she was born in 1666. She was born also to a family of relative means, and her father also died when she was quite young, when she was 13. And after that, she was not placed in a cloister, but she did have her options limited because her family fell into financial difficulties, which meant that she didn't have a dowry. And if you don't have a dowry, you cannot marry. So she was left without much of the prospects, and she didn't have this alternative option to go into a cloister as she wanted. And after her mother died when she was in her early 20s, she moved to London, where she started her writing, her educating, and her correspondences with different both men and women figures. That's also where she received a certain charity from the Archbishop of Canterbury, and where she started her correspondences with John Norris. So that's a very brief background of these two women. Well, as I mentioned, I cannot go too much into it. In the case of Suchon also because there is not that much, but it's still important in these figures to actually place them in their proper value and to not just do what we often do with these male canonical figures of giving them the genius status above time. Like their philosophy speaks for itself, and that's also a disservice to the history of philosophy. So that's with that background. Let's look at their works. These works, these women wrote quite extensive corpuses on women. And what's quite extraordinary, these works were also addressed to women, explicitly to women readers. Gabrielle Suchon wrote both her treatises for women addressed to women, which is quite very rare in the early modern period, even though that there were women that philosophized and wrote about it and argued for women's equality. That was usually just a small part of their works. Well, with especially Suchon, that features way more in this case. So let's get to them. I'm briefly gonna mention them, not go too into depth about them because limited time. So Suchon wrote 3 treatises actually. Two we have still surviving. The other we only have a title. That was something about the Christian life, but there's no surviving um, content of that. But these 2 treatises were both over 600 words. The first one is Treatise on Ethics and Politics, written in 1693. It divided into 3 parts: knowledge, freedom, knowledge, and authority, where it is shown that persons of this female sex have a natural capacity that enables them to benefit from these prerogatives, now denied them. This is a true revelation when you read this book. I cannot recommend enough to actually go and read this for yourself. Here she gives a very stark, well argued for, and very beautifully written analysis of the patriarchy before that word existed. So she really argues that women are capable, are equal, and should have these prerogatives, but they're denied them. And why? Because men don't want to give up their power, basically. And then the second book she wrote is on the or treatise she wrote is on the celibate life, freely chosen, written in 1700, or Life Without Commitments. And that's a bit her manifesto, her way of saying how should we then actually live, and that is a life without commitments, meaning a bit of a Disney called it a third legal category for women. In France, they had basically 2 paths that were known to them: cloister or marriage, nothing in between. And Suchon says, no. It's this life is beneficial for us, for society in general, and you can actually do this. So these were the 2 treaties she wrote, and I'll also focus on the content of these treaties in the rest of the presentation. Then Mary Astell. Mary Astell wrote a variety of books in a variety of styles. She wrote poetry, letters, political pamphlets. But because of time constraints, also in my own research, I'm going to focus on 2 of her books, namely A Serious Proposal to the Ladies, written in 1697, or published, I should say, in 1697, for the advancement of their true and greatest interest, in 2 parts, where she argues that women, or where she wants women to become educated, where she really gives this analysis also of how women are suppressed and give them an option how to overcome that oppression. And then some reflections upon marriage, written or published in 1700, occasioned by the Duke and Duchess of Mazarine's case, which is also considered. Here she uses this case of the Duke and Duchess of Mazarine. The Duchess of Mazarine was in an unhappy marriage, then fled away from her husband and ended up in poverty. So here she wants women to have pause, though this treatise was actually not directed towards women. She later went back and said, yeah, yes, I'm a woman, because apparently men have figured out that it's probably a woman writing that, but you shouldn't focus on that. It's still valid. And one of the difficult parts in interpreting this work, though, is that it's quite sarcastic. So it's not easy to know what her actual marriage message is, but it seems very clear. Woman, be careful. Men in their courteous practices want to kind of snare you into vice, and once you're under their control, you cannot leave. So be careful. It's also sometimes read as a word that says "don't marry at all," but that's not possibly not what she meant. So these are the works. And then I want to have a brief reflection on their methodologies within it. So their argumentative strategies refer on different approaches. They refer to reasons, examples for history, especially Suchon does that constantly talk about look at all these women who have existed throughout history who we know and who did all these extraordinarily illustrious things, she would say. How can we then still deny that women have these capacities? And they refer to different authors, especially Suchon, again, has quite modern, let's say, academic standards, as in she actually refers to the authors, differentiates between quotation, doesn't want to plagiarize things. Of course, it would not hold up to common peer review, but she tries. And the authors they refer to are from variety of sources. They refer to Christian, biblical, and patristic writing, classical sources such as Greek and Roman philosophers. You cannot ever escape Plato and Aristotle, of course. They also feature in their works, and contemporary authors of their own time. For Mary Astell, that was Descartes, and for Gabrielle Suchon, that was Pelé de Labarre, who's another maybe lesser known early modern feminist. And what's very interesting, especially Suchon wrote down explicitly her hermeneutic theory, which she bases on that of Saint Bernard, and where she writes that texts can be seen as material things which rightly have various uses and serve different functions. See, she used that to say, I can reinterpret the Bible, subvert these common interpretation that men give to oppress women without speaking nonsense. And that's an important thread in both of their works, is reinterpreting these classical interpretations of the Bible, going back to the source material and saying how men have interpreted it to diminish women. Bullshit. So let's get to what they really mean and get to real theology. So with that extensive background, we can now go into why we're here, philosophy. So let's see how Suchon and Astell, what their account of women's oppression was. So first, that we actually go back to the context for a second. We go back to the woman question. That's an important role. That's the first thing that they have to answer for their account, and that's very important. And they also have a very clear answer to that question, namely, yes, men and women are equal, and women are rational creatures, are equal in the eyes of God. And they actually use quite clear theological support for that. Indeed, Suchon wrote in her Treatise for Ethics and Politics, natural intelligence spawned by reason and the light of faith and bestowed by grace is equally common to men and women, because these blessings come directly from God and from the very core of our nature, which is both unique in each of us and of the same species in the two sexes. Now, no being can truly exist without the power to act, since he would be idle and useless. Power and operation are indeed inseparable from substance. I think this quote speaks quite beautifully for itself. God created man and woman equal. They created them both rational to be useful. Let's give them both this opportunity. Well, that stuff comes later, but that's the background. Clearly, men and women are equal. And that's also what Estelle writes in her, that is a serious proposal. She writes, God does nothing in vain. He gives no power of faculty which he has not allotted to some proportionate use. If therefore he has given to mankind, everyone in mankind, a rational mind, every individual understanding ought to be employed in somewhat worthy of it. Again, it speaks for itself. Mankind, that includes both women and men, are rational creatures, and we should not just should be allowed, but actually morally should use these capabilities because God created them for us, and we need to use them in order to get to God. But they go even further than that. They're not content to just say men and women are equal in nature, but maybe, God created some kind of hierarchy. You could then be equal, but still in a kind of hierarchy of your mind is the same. But no, they are very clear. Men have usurped authority, and they have actually used the Bible to argue for their natural God given authority. These women say, no, 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 let me read the creation story as it was meant to. And that is what they do. Indeed, Suchon writes in her treatise on ethics and politics again, God for God formed men and women in his image and likeness. He gave them power and dominion conjointly over the animals of the earth, the fishes of the sea, and over all that is under the heavens. He made them both masters in equal measure. And his commandment to populate the earth and subjugate it was for Eve as well as for Adam, to whom the Lord gave her as a companion and an associate, not a servant or a slave. The difference is a matter of the sexes' bodies, not their minds, who are one and the same in our Lord, as the great apostle, she refers here to St. Paul, teaches us. That is such a powerful reinterpretation of the normal creation story, which is usually used within the church to say God created Adam as a slave for Eve. But she says no, this authority that they claim, that's usurped, that's a misinterpretation of religion, because religion is usually or quite often used by men or by dominant groups to kind of keep themselves in power. And that we do also find something similar in Astell, who subverts this creation story. For the earthly Adams being formed before Eve seems as little to prove her natural subjection to him as the living creatures, fishes, birds, and beasts being formed before them both proves that mankind must be subjected to these animals. Nor can the apostle mean that, oh, Eve only sinned, or that she was deceived, for if Adam sinned willingly and knowingly, he became the greater transgressor. Again, there is this classical use of the biblical story to dominate women, to put them in a lesser rank in authority. They both say, bullshit. No, that doesn't track. Instead, let's read these properly and subvert. And so they give an account of how men and women are actually equal, and they don't only do that with the classical biblical story of the creation story, also with other examples, but it would be quite a long presentation if I needed to mention all these examples. So yes, then I hope with these few examples at least, you can take my word for it that they both see women as rational creatures, as equal to men. Women are equal to men. Men usurp their power. That's in both their accounts. Their power is not natural, not God-given. It's actually taken by force. And they give clear theological support for their positions, refer to the Bible, and gives a new interpretation to give these conclusions. But that doesn't quite solve the whole question of why women are in the position they are, because, okay, they've now proven that women are equal, but they're still weaker. And with weaker, I should say, in the sense of in that time period, or at least the critique was, women are more vain, more idle, are more ignorant, are more prone to vice. How does that then come about if women are actually learned, rational, and capable of reason? Well, they both hold women are denied the tools to cultivate this virtue. So, and here is where their epistemologies really come into play. The importance of knowledge becomes clear through this combination of theology and philosophy. Suchon's theory of knowledge combines an Aristotelian account of knowledge with an Augustinian narrative of the fall. This Augustinian narrative of the fall, I think most of you are familiar with that idea. Basically, after God kicked Adam and Eve out of paradise because of the original sin, human beings were diminished in their rational and moral capacities. However, what Suchon does, and it's also mirrored a bit in Astell, is combining this with a philosophy, a theory of knowledge that allows us to reclaim these abilities. So Suchon combines this with an Aristotelian theory of knowledge that is basically an empirical account of how we can gain knowledge, true knowledge of the world through the senses. And because she combines these two, she says that learning is an essential human task of reparative labor. We are capable of repairing our flawed capacities. And that's essential for our access to the afterlife, for being virtuous on earth now. And something similar happens in the theory of Astell. She combines a Cartesian theory with knowledge of with an Anglican narrative of the fall. This Anglican narrative of the fall is basically the same story in the post-lapsarian state. So after the fall, human beings have diminished rational and moral capacities. But if we take the card and plop him next to that, you can see that through um, rationalism, to this reason, to logical thinking, we can derive true knowledge and we can repair these broken qualities. So for her, again, education is an solution or a remedy to the impediments of our moral and rational capacities. What these women here do is a very important step. We'll later see why knowledge is that important and how they um, really link ignorance to vice. But in their epistemologies, they make it possible for human beings to repair their flawed nature and to get to their ultimate step, to their ultimate being as rational beings. And this combination of philosophy and theology is essential in their accounts, I would argue. And that's what brings us to the importance of knowledge in Suchon's account. Suchon holds that knowledge is a necessary condition for freedom, autonomy, and in turn authority. And she believes that ignorance is a great evil because it causes great distress. It also results to vices. If you don't know what your true good is, you will be led by the passions. In the early modern period, this reason versus passion debate was very important, but you will be prey to your passions and you will become vain rather than listen to reason if you are kept ignorant. And she's also very, very clear in this very beautiful, stark criticism of male institutions and power structures that this ignorance of women is the direct result of the man-made institutions and of the wills and whims of men. Men erect these colleges, make these spaces for learning, and then close the gate, kick women out, and are very clear it serves them if women are ignorant because then they're easier to control. And that keeps women from fulfilling their true potential as rational creatures and reasonable beings. So, our solution is to educate women, and that doesn't necessarily need to upset the status quo. She doesn't say, okay, let's now storm these institutions, or in a less graphic way. No, she says we can make our own schools for women and educate them within that framework. But it's clear women need to be educated. And one of my favorite passages from Suchon also very clearly demonstrate that connection between ignorance um, and vice, and the fact that women can be learned and how men control women. That's this passage. It is in this sense that persons of the sex are true wonders, because they possess the kind of reason, intelligence, judgment, mind, and will that can learn and know everything. Nonetheless, these sparks, lights, and flames are hidden and buried under the ashes of bad custom and of the conduct of those who cannot bear that women shine, or that they appear as they truly are, and even less as what they could be if they had a different upbringing. Women are denied the knowledge, the necessary education, and that's what keeps them dimmed. Both to custom, also reinforced by women, but mostly by being denied by men. And this importance of knowledge, again, also comes back in Astell. She holds that knowledge is necessary to protect women from ill-meaning men, and to cure their afterlife. She has this virtue theory that once you become virtuous, you can fulfill your role and go to heaven. That's very important to have the correct knowledge of God. But also in her reflections upon marriage, she very clearly talks about this idea how men, often with quite bad intentions, will come in and try to seduce women and trap them, as I already said. And the only way to kind of protect women from that is by making them be educated. So that's why ignorance is so bad, because it disposes women to vices. Just the same, if you're led by your passions, if you don't know what your ultimate goods are, you will be led astray because our moral capacities are damaged because of the fall. And it places women under the domination of the tyranny of men. That's what I just already said. If you cannot find a way to escape, if you attach too much meaning to this relationship, to this marriage, you're likely to fall for a bad suitor who then just kind of abuses that position. And on Stell's account, she does hold that marriage is sanctioned by God. So once you are in a marriage, you're done, basically. Like there is no, she doesn't hold that divorce is a good option. On her account, God has sanctioned men within marriage to be the tyrant, to fully have this position of authority. So please don't choose the wrong person, because you might be out of luck then. And this ignorance keeps, again, women from fulfilling their true potential in serving the community and in serving God, because that's ultimately our aim. So again, she holds that women should be educated in the necessary disciplines to cultivate their virtue and judgment. And we also see a passage, see that clearly in her words, that ignorance is one of the worst things that woman can be. She writes, "Neither God nor nature have excluded them from being ornaments to their families and useful in their generations. There is no reason they should be content to be ciphers in the world, useless at best, and in a little time a burden and nuisance to all about them. The cause, therefore, of the defects we labor under is, if not wholly, yet at least in the first place, to be ascribed to the mistakes of our educations, which, like an error in the first concoction, spreads its ill influence through all our lives." Again, I think this quote speaks for itself, but I'll very briefly say what's important to get from this. Of course, women are capable of learning, women are capable of being in these great positions and do so much good, but they're denied education, that this education, lack of education, I should say, corrupts them more, and that leads them to be just a hindrance within society. Because if half the world is useless because they're denied education, what good could that ever serve for society? And that leads us to like these patriarchal machinery of domination. The question then becomes, so we have proven that women are capable of learning and that learning is a good thing. And we all know, right? Being educated leads us closer to God. If women are capable of learning, why are they ignorant? Well, because this idea of the ignorant woman, this idea of that women should be not receive their status as rational beings, is perpetuated through custom by men, sometimes also by women, but mostly patriarchy, and is actively reinforced through, for example, the woman's defective nature prejudice. This idea is theorized by Sowell, who talks about this idea that women are denied in their early formative years in education, which and are constantly told, you're not a rational being, you're incapable of learning. Then once they get to the age that they could benefit from this learning, they've already internalized that their nature is inferior, so they don't solve this by getting educated. If you're constantly told and proven that you're inferior, at some point you'll start to believe it. And that's also something that Suchon picks up on. And she's very critical of this, much more so from this is directly the result of what men want. She talks about how first men deny a woman from being educated, which of course leads them to be uneducated and not have the tools right now to do all these exercises in logic, for example. Then they point to these uneducated women as proof that they cannot be educated. And so the vicious circle continues to keep women from achieving any kind of knowledge or liberation. So a bit of a overview. Why are women in chains? Well, it's because they are denied the education of they denied education to continue their virtue. They are very clear, both of them, that ignorance is a cause of great evil, that it leads to vice and distress, that knowledge is such a necessary and important tool for both sexes. They hold it for both sexes, but of course, men are not denied, at least systematically, and all men. I know I should premise this with or preface it. A lot of people, a lot of men in these societies were also denied this education, but at least in the upper class, middle class, where they were in, men were not systematically denied this kind of education. But knowledge is for them very important and can remedy the consequences of the fall. So, what men do, or what happens, maybe not as intentionally on both their accounts, is that women are denied access to knowledge. And that is the main side of oppression, because their ignorance leads them to be in bad situations in society, that is within courtship, marriage, and the cloister. The cloister is mostly Suchon, who writes that the cloister is oppressive because, of course, in a Catholic context, it's quite hierarchical, and women are, on both their accounts, actually, in these normal religious institutions, denied to actually read the primary text of the Bible and other primary religious texts, and are only get filtered like some crumbs, some kind of knowledge that men deem worthy for them to be passed on, which doesn't really lead them to really an understanding of religion or God. And this, so the in this in both their works, they give an analysis of the patriarchy. One might say. I know I'm using vastly anachronist terms, but let's ignore that for a second. I use these terms to actually show how they already, let's say, a couple hundred years before Foucault, talked about power, talked about knowledge, how they interacted. But of course, it takes a man to say the exact same thing women have been talking for ages for them to be taken seriously. So what do they say? They both give an analysis of the patriarchy avant la lettre, and they do so by first proving that women are naturally equal and have the capacity to become virtuous. So to first equal the ground, and then to prove that men debase women, men usurp the authority, and then men deny women education to become on a socially equal level. And this exclusion from authority is not just bad for women, but for society as a whole. So actually, they both say, like, hey, man, you should also care about this because it does also affect you. Maybe that makes you listen. This exclusion, women's dependence, is on many levels. On the spiritual levels, as I said, they're denied the primary text of religion. It happens on a political level. I think that kind of speaks for itself. And on a private level, in a household, in a marriage, but also in a normal family situation, women are the superiors of men. Superiors, inferiors. We would like it the other way around sometimes, but that's also one of the interesting things. These women are quite interesting in this debate, in this querelle de femme, because they talk about how men and women are equal, and usually it's either a lot of the currents or a lot of the conversation, men are inferior, or women are, men are inferior or men are superior. Um, some actually argue that women are superior, that women are more illustrious than men, but they argue for equality, and it makes them quite unique. So this exclusion from authority is quite damaging from all, because it keeps women from doing so many good deeds in service of their community and God. So then we come finally to the liberation of women. As I said, this will be a shorter part, also because time is running out. Um, and one of the most important parts in their account of liberation is their analysis of the oppression. So we've already seen a large part of what leads their feminism to women's liberation. That is understanding the oppression. Because if you can point out to where the system has failed you, then you can start to remedy it. As a woman, you first have to realize that your human nature is equal to that of men, that you're both rational creatures, that you're capable of restoring these post-lapsarian consequences, the importance of knowledge. So this idea of epistemology, maybe not spelled out as such, but this idea that you're capable of improving your faculties, and the importance of virtue. You need to cultivate this idea that woman, you want to be virtuous, you want to rise up in this sense so that you can serve your place in society. And that leads them to a call of education, which they both do in two distinct ways. Suchon argues for the life of the neutralist. That's the life of someone without commitments. So someone who isn't married, who isn't in a cloister, but also is not linked to the rules of a profession, for example. So the rules of an university and how we need to behave or learn our output within that. So what she wants is a woman to live in solitude with some friendship and some outreach, but a sort of disinterested friendship and outreach, and to become educated by yourself, learn and cultivate this relationship with God. She writes all these rules down in this second treatise, but it's too much to all cover now. And Astell goes the opposite direction. She proposes a cloister, basically, but she calls it a religious retreat. It's a cloister without the hierarchy, and women are free to leave, but she wants to cultivate a community where girls and women can come together, be educated, support each other, and most importantly, where these women are sheltered from the world and from men who might impose wrong ideas in their mind. Now, at the first glance, these proposals might seem super opposite. Suchon argues for complete solitude. Well, not complete, but mostly solitude, while Astell argues for a community, a sort of heaven on earth to work together. But these are more in line than you might at first glance think. For example, Suchon, as I told you a bit ago, also proposed to make schools for women where they could become educated. So this cloister, this secular retreat where women could leave, could be seen as this temporary step to educate women while they're young to then go live the life of a neutralist. And also contrary, because this cloister that Astell, or this retreat that Astell proposed, never got built, she also proposed in her second part to the proposal to the ladies certain rules for thinking to improve a woman's mind. And that could be seen as a life of the neutralist. Rules of thinking were based on Descartes, but a bit more specifically directed towards women. So what both these women want is a way to educate women. And both of their goal is sometimes they both recognize that we live in a society, maybe we cannot overcome the power that men have over us. But what we can do is cultivate this stoic inner freedom. So Shaw holds that the only place men cannot dominate is your mind. Let's increase our minds. And also Estelle says, even if you're in this marriage with this insufferable husband who you cannot escape, what you can do is educate yourself and get a bit of like a content through suffering and this Christian martyrdom almost. So actually these women seem to do the same thing or have somewhat the same ends. So then to conclude, I want to get back to these categories or this new school that I proposed. But first, before that, I want to preface this conversation to go back to the elephant or the proto-feminists in the room, whether we should call them feminist or proto-feminist. In this presentation or in my research, I don't want to take a position on this yet, but I want to outline it a bit because it seems quite strange to bracket something in a new school that I'm coining or proposing. And there are good reasons to call them feminist and there are good reasons to call them proto-feminist. I would lean more towards the feminist side because they both call for equal, both hold that men and women are equal in nature, radical equality. They both critique the patriarchy, or at least the power structures that keep men having authority over women and how they abuse that. And they both call for an education for women to liberate themselves, to rise up. However, they also do accept to a certain extent the status quo. Mary Astell says once you're in a marriage, there's no way to escape it. And Gabrielle Suchon also holds that maybe we shouldn't overthrow men yet. So they maybe don't go far enough for current feminist standards. But again, in the spirit of diversifying philosophy, maybe you also want to diversify the term a little bit and accept that it's broader than we might, in our current way of thinking, want to approach it, which also allows us to research a lot of more of women and include them more. So let's now get back to this term, the theological virtue proto-feminism. I hope by now it's clear what I mean by that. This approach really highlights their biblical ontology, how they subvert the creation story, among other parts, to say that men and women are equal. They both give importance to their post-Lapsarian epistemology, this combination of philosophy and theology, to say that women should be educated because they should remedy their diminished capacities or their flawed faculties. And these can be remedied, most importantly. And their Christian faith plays an important role because the ultimate good that people, including women, can serve is serve the community and then reach their goal to go to heaven. And that's denied women to a large extent if they cannot really learn religion. So then that leads me to conclude that, as Smith points out, a lot of authors, when talking about the proto-feminism or feminism of these women, kind of want to sweep the religious aspect under the rug, want to sweep Astell's story, political background under the rug, because that doesn't quite fit with our expectations of what feminism should be. That doesn't quite adhere to what we believe philosophy should be. This religion, this theology is quite ugly. But I think that that is the very core of what these women argue for and the very core of their feminism. And we should accept these women fully and study them fully and not make them adhere to the rules that we have set in our current sentence. So I want to conclude by sneaking one more woman into this presentation very briefly, one of my favorite quotes as well. Anna-Maria van Schuurman has said in the 17th century as well, to one reading the history, often of long expenses of the time, the monuments of our women's name seem no greater than the traces of a ship passing in the sea. Women have been excluded a voice for so long, and we're not gonna include them again by making them fit our standards. Let's give them proper respect. Let's have a conversation with them, let them have a conversation, and do some effort to include them. Thank you.